Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into a decade that could not decide what it wanted to be and somehow became all of it at once. We're talking about the 1970s and specifically the subcultures that took the whole thing over. The shimmering dance floors and the smoke-filled basements, the platform boots and the safety pins, the long-haired dreamers still holding on, and the leather-jacketed kids already tearing it all down. It was a decade with a soundtrack for every kind of person, and tonight we're going to wander through all of them. Before we settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is the kind of quiet corner of the internet you actually enjoy getting lost in. And truly, thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You always seem to know exactly where I want to wander next, and it means more than you probably realise. Ideas like yours are the reason this little channel keeps growing at all. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I know someone out there is halfway between awake and asleep right now, and I am glad you came along. And if you would rather take this with you, the channel is on Spotify now too. The link is down in the description whenever you want it. Now go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft, steady hum, pull the blanket up, sink into the pillow, and let the whole long day fall away behind you. Because I want you to wonder, just for a moment, what it actually felt like to be alive back then. What did a Friday night sound like when the whole block was getting ready to go out? What did a record store smell like on a rainy afternoon, all cardboard and vinyl and somebody's cigarette burning by the register? What did it feel like to be young and completely certain that the song coming out of the speakers was speaking only to you? What did the city look like at 2 a.m, when one crowd was still dancing and another was only just plugging in? And just like that, it is 1976. Somewhere a mirror ball is turning. Somewhere a guitar is being tuned through a cheap amp in a back room. The night is warm, the streetlights are humming, and the whole restless, glittering decade is only getting started. Let us start where the decade shines brightest, on a dance floor well past midnight. The room is dark except for the mirror ball turning slow and patient overhead, scattering little squares of light across every upturned face. The bass comes up through the soles of your shoes before you even hear it, that steady 4-count thump that does not ask you to dance so much as decide it for you. The air is warm and close, thick with perfume and cigarette smoke and the sweetness of somebody's spilled drink. Strangers move beside you like you have known them for years, and for these few hours in a way you have. It is a kind of belonging that lived only in that room, only in that light, and it is harder to find now than anyone realized at the time. You did not come here alone, but you didn't really come here with anyone either. That was the quiet magic of the place. Out on that floor, the ordinary rules about who you were supposed to know and who you were supposed to be simply loosened their grip. The mailman was out there somewhere, and the school teacher, and the shy fellow from the bank who never says much, and under these lights none of it mattered in the slightest. The music had a way of dissolving the labels people carried around all week. You were just another body moving in the dark, and that turned out to be one of the most freeing things a person could be. The disc jockey up in his booth is the closest thing this room has to a preacher, and he knows it. He watches the floor the way a good cook watches a pot, feeling for the exact moment the crowd is ready to be lifted a little higher. He does not let the music stop, not ever, and that was the whole revolution of it. One song bleeds into the next on a single unbroken current, so the feeling never breaks, never lets you go, never gives you a reason to walk back to the edge of the room and remember your own name. You just keep moving. The night just keeps going. Somewhere in there you lose track of the hour entirely. Your feet ache and you do not care. Your shirt is damp and you do not care about that either. Someone hands you a drink and you take it, and the ice is cold against your fingers, and a woman you've never met before is laughing at something over the noise, throwing her head back so the light catches her earrings. You laugh too, though you never heard the joke. It did not require a joke. That was the thing people got so wrong about it later when they made it all sound so shallow. It was not shallow at all. It was people who'd been told to be careful their whole lives finding one warm room where, for a few hours, they didn't have to be. The floor beneath you is alive. You can feel the vibration of every other dancer through the soles of your shoes, 40 hearts and 80 feet all keeping the same time, and there is a comfort in that you cannot quite put into words. In the daylight the world was full of walls. Here there were none. Here a stranger might catch your eye across the room and simply smile, and the smile meant only what it appeared to mean, which was welcome, which was you belong here too, which was so rare out in the ordinary world that people drove across whole cities just to feel it for one night. And the outfits, oh, the outfits. The light strikes 100 small mirrors sewn into 100 bold shirts, and the whole floor seems to shimmer like the surface of a lake at noon. People dressed for this. They saved up for it, planned for it, laid the clothes out on the bed in the afternoon light and imagined this exact moment. There is a devotion in that which we have largely let slip away, the willingness to make an ordinary Saturday into an event, to treat a few hours of your own life as though they truly mattered. Because to the people in this room they truly did. Toward the end, the very end, when the sky outside has begun its slow turn toward grey, the music finally softens. The disc jockey feels it coming and eases everyone down gently, the way you would set a sleeping child in a bed. The floor thins out. People find their coats. There are long hugs at the door with folks whose names you will never learn, and promises to come back next week that some will keep and some will not. You step out into the cool morning air and it hits you like a splash of water, and the street is quiet and the birds have started, and the whole ordinary world is exactly where you left it. But you're not quite the same as you were when you walked in. Something in you got let out for a few hours, and it does not go all the way back into the box. That was the gift of the discotheque after dark, a gift so simple it is easy to mock and so precious it is nearly impossible to find now. It gave you one warm room, one steady beat, and permission, just for a night to belong. Before you ever reach that dance floor, there is the ritual of getting ready, and back then, getting ready was half the night. Your good shirt is laid across the bed, the one with the wide collar and the pattern loud enough to be heard across a crowded room. The iron hisses. Somebody's record is playing down the hall while you stand at the mirror, working at your hair until it finally does the thing you saw in the magazine. The whole apartment smells of hairspray and aftershave and pure anticipation. There was a joy in it that we have mostly misplaced, in dressing not just to be seen, but to become someone a little braver than you were on a Tuesday afternoon. The bathroom's occupied, of course. It is always occupied. Somebody's in there running the water too long, and somebody else is knocking on the door, and there is a friendly argument about whose turn it is that nobody actually means. The whole place hums with a shared electricity. 3 or 4 of you all getting ready at once, borrowing each other's things, calling questions down the hall. Can I use your comb? Does this look all right? Are we leaving at 9 or 10? Nobody is quite dressed yet and the night has not started, but this, right here, is already part of the fun, maybe the best part, though you would not have admitted it then. You stand at the mirror and you begin the slow work of becoming the version of yourself that goes out. It starts with the shirt, unbuttoned 1 button lower than your mother would like, the collar spread wide like a pair of wings. Then the trousers, cut close at the top and flared at the ankle so they sway when you walk. You turn side to side, checking the line of it, and the person looking back at you is starting to seem like someone with somewhere important to be. That was the trick of the clothes. They did not just cover you. They changed the way you carried yourself, straightened your spine, lifted your chin a half an inch. The hair is its own long chapter. You have a picture torn from a magazine wedged into the corner of the mirror, and you're trying, with real determination, to make what grows out of your own head match it. There is the blow dryer, roaring away. There is the comb and the pick. and the small can of spray that will hold the whole architecture in place against the humidity of a crowded room. It takes patience. It takes a few tries. And when it finally sits right, when it finally does the thing, you feel a little jolt of triumph out of all proportion to the achievement, and you think, all right, now we are getting somewhere. Then comes the scent, splashed on with a heavy and hopeful hand. Everyone wore too much of it, and the whole apartment ended up smelling like a department store counter, and nobody minded one bit. It was the smell of the evening beginning. It got into your coat and stayed there for days, so that on Monday, sitting at your desk, you could catch a faint trace of it and feel the whole glittering night come rushing back. Scent was memory you could carry in your collar, and everyone that decade wore theirs like a promise. There is a full-length mirror in somebody's room, and one at a time you all step in front of it for the final inspection. The others weigh in, honestly, the way only real friends will. That is the one. No, the other shirt. Turn around. Yeah, that is it. There is a generosity in it, everyone wanting everyone else to look their best because you were going out together and you would arrive together, and in a way you would all be judged together. So you fussed over each other, you fixed each other's collars, you told each other the truth. The clock on the wall keeps nudging you along, and there is a sweet, unbearable tension in those last few minutes. Coats half on, keys somewhere, one person still not ready and swearing, they will only be a second. The record gets flipped one last time. Someone checks their wallet. Someone checks their hair again, and one final time in the hall mirror by the door. And then, at last, you're all out on the landing, clattering down the stairs into the cool evening, laughing, alive, the whole night stretched out ahead of you like a road with the streetlights just coming on. We have lost some of this, I think. We get ready alone now, mostly, quiet and quick, checking a small screen instead of a big mirror. But there was something in that old ritual worth remembering, the way an ordinary night was treated as an occasion worth an hour of preparation, the way becoming your bolder self was a thing you did together, with music and friends and far too much cologne. Getting ready was not the boring part before the fun, it was where the fun quietly began. Now step sideways from the discotheque into a place with all the same music and twice the danger, the roller rink on a Saturday night. The floor is polished blonde wood, slick beneath your wheels, and the organ music your parents remember has been shoved aside for something with a pulse. Coloured lights sweep across the boards. The wheels of 40 skaters make one low, continuous roar, like surf, and every so often someone glides past you backward, as though gravity simply made an exception for them. You wobble, you find your legs, you catch the rhythm, and for one lap the whole rink moves as a single spinning wheel. There is a simple, uncomplicated happiness in it that no screen has ever managed to replace. The rink was where the whole town's youth turned up, and that was the beauty of it. The little kids were here, clinging to the rail and inching along with their tongues out in concentration. The teenagers were here, showing off, circling, pretending not to watch each other and watching each other constantly. Even a few grown-ups were here, gliding along with a competence that surprised their own children. It was one of the last places where all the ages mixed, where a 9-year-old and a 19-year-old shared the same wooden floor and the same booming song, and nobody thought a thing of it. You paid your money at the front and laced up your rentals, those scuffed brown skates with the orange wheels that had carried 1,000 feet before yours. Lacing them tight was an art. Too loose, and your ankles wandered. Too tight, and you lost all the feeling in your toes by the third song. You got it just right, stood up carefully, and rolled out onto the floor on legs that always felt, for the first minute, like they belonged to somebody else. Then the old memory came back into your body and you were away. The organ music was gone, and that was the whole revolution of the decade right there, packed into a small building off the highway. Now the same records that shook the discotheque came pounding out of the rink's speakers, and the floor filled up and started to move to it. The disc jockey, up in his little booth with a wall of coloured buttons, ran the whole night like a conductor. He called the couple skate, and the floor cleared of all but the brave pairs holding hands. He called the all skate, and everyone poured back on at once. He dimmed the lights for the slow songs, and the whole rink went soft and dreamy. There was always one skater who could really do it, and everyone secretly wanted to be him. He skated backward without looking. He crossed one foot over the other around the curves as easy as walking. He spun, he dipped, he wove through the slower skaters like water finding its way downhill, and the rest of us just tried to stay upright and out of his path. You learned by watching him. You practiced the crossover on the far turn where fewer people could see you fall, and when you finally strung two of them together without going down, it felt like flying. And you did fall. Everyone fell. That was part of the deal. You caught an edge, or somebody cut you off, or your own 2 feet simply disagreed about which way to go, and down you went onto the hardwood with a smack that everyone heard. But you got up. You always got up laughing, rubbing the sore spot, and you rolled right back into the flow, because the alternative was sitting on the sidelines watching everyone else have the time of their lives. There was a small brave lesson in that, learned over and over on a Saturday night, that you fall and you get up and you keep moving with the crowd. The snack bar glowed at the far end, and between sessions you clomped over on your skates to buy a soda and a soft pretzel, your legs still humming from the floor. You sat on the carpeted benches with your friends and caught your breath, and watched the lights sweep the empty rink, and it was almost as good as skating, that in-between time, the whole night warm and unhurried around you. Then the DJ called the next all skate, and you crammed the last of the pretzel in your mouth and rushed back out. At the end of the night your legs were rubber and your face ached from grinning, and your ears rang pleasantly in the sudden quiet of the parking lot. You handed back the rentals, put your own shoes on, and they felt strange and heavy and earthbound after hours on wheels. Someone's parent was idling at the curb. You piled in, sweaty and happy and already talking about next Saturday. It is a simple thing to describe and almost impossible to explain to anyone who never felt it. That low roar of the wheels, that sweep of coloured light, that whole town of people rolling in one direction to one song. But those of us who were there remember exactly how it felt, and we remember it was more than enough. Let us leave the lights behind now and follow the noise, all the way down to a narrow, unlovely stretch of the Bowery in New York. There is a bar there with a torn awning and a name most of the country cannot yet pronounce, and inside something is being born that the rest of America will not understand for years. The stage is barely a stage. The bathroom is already a legend for all the wrong reasons. But the kids crowding in tonight did not come for comfort. They came for the sound. 3 chords played fast and loud and furious by people who look exactly like them. It is small, it is scrappy, and it is quietly about to change everything. You would walk right past it in the daylight, and most people did. The block was rough, and the doorway was dark, and the place looked, from the outside, like somewhere your mother would grab your arm and steer you away from. But that was precisely the point. This was not a room that wanted to be found by everybody. It wanted to be found by the people who needed it, and the people who needed it always seemed to find their way, drawn down the block by the muffled thunder leaking out through the walls. Inside it was long and narrow and dark, more like a hallway than a club, with the stage down at the far end raised barely a foot off the floor. There was no distance between the band and the crowd, no barrier, no grandeur, nothing. The person singing was close enough to touch, sweating the same sweat you were sweating, breathing the same close air. And that closeness was the whole revolution. For years the music had lived far away, up on giant stages in giant arenas, played by people who seemed less like humans than like gods. Here, it was handed right back to you, close enough to reach. The bands were made of ordinary kids. That was the astonishing thing. The thing that lit a fire in so many people who stood in that room. They were not virtuosos. Some of them had picked up their instruments only months before. They played fast because fast was exciting, and they played loud because loud was honest, and if a song fell apart halfway through, they just grinned and started it over. The message, though nobody put it into words, came through loud and clear to every kid pressed against that little stage. You could do this. You, whoever you were. You did not need permission or training or a fortune in equipment. You needed 3 chords and enough nerve to get up there. The crowd was a scene unto itself, a gathering of the town's odd and its bright and its restless, the ones who never fit anywhere else. They came in their thrift store jackets and their strange haircuts. And here, for once, they were not the strange ones. Here they were the majority. You could see people recognizing each other across the room, a whole tribe discovering night by night that it was a tribe at all. There is a particular joy in finding your people after years of thinking there were none, and that little room was full of that joy, packed to the walls with it. It was not comfortable. Let us not pretend it was comfortable. It was hot and it was loud and it smelled of stale beer and the bathroom truly was as bad as the legends say. But comfort was not what anyone came for. They came for the electricity of it, the sense that they were standing at the exact centre of something real and new, something that belonged to them and not to the record executives uptown or the radio programmers or anyone else who had spent the decade telling them what they were supposed to like. And they were right. That is the remarkable part. Standing in that dark, narrow room on a random weeknight, they could feel that something enormous was taking shape, and history proved them correct. The sound that got born on that tiny stage would travel out from that block and cross the ocean and circle the whole world, and decades later, kids who were not even alive yet would form bands because of what a handful of unknowns played in a bar most people would not walk into. But none of them knew that yet, and that innocence is the most beautiful thing about it. They were not making history. They were just making noise together, in the only room that would have them, on a rough block downtown where nobody important was watching. The greatest things so often begin exactly like this, small and unnoticed and gloriously unafraid, in a place the rest of the world has not thought to look. Tonight, the whole thing is still a secret. Tomorrow belongs to somebody else. But right now, in this room, it belongs entirely to them. Let us talk about how these kids looked, because the look was the whole message. There is no money in this scene, and that is rather the point. Your jacket came from a thrift store and your jeans are held together by safety pins that you turn into a decision rather than an accident. Somebody took kitchen scissors to their own hair an hour ago. The entire style says, plainly and almost cheerfully, that you never needed anyone's permission to become something new. Against a decade of polyester and Polish, it landed like a slap and a grin at the very same time. Everything about the look was made, not bought, and that was the heart of it. This was the great age of the shopping mall, of matching outfits ordered from glossy catalogues, of a whole country being told exactly what to wear and where to buy it. And here was a pack of kids who looked at all of that and turned firmly the other way. They dressed themselves out of what the world had thrown away. A jacket from a church rummage sale 3 sizes too big. A shirt from a dead man's closet. Boots someone's older brother wore in a job he quit. They took the cast-offs and made them into armour. The safety pin was the perfect little emblem of the whole thing. It was cheap. It was everywhere. It was the most ordinary object in any household drawer. And they took it and made it a statement, using it to hold together a torn sleeve. Yes, but also just to wear, pinned through a collar or a cuff for no reason but the look of it. There was a wit in that, a sly humour that people often missed. It said, "I will build my whole self out of the smallest, cheapest things you have, and I will make it mean something, and there is not a thing you can do about it." The hair was cut at home, in front of the bathroom mirror, often by a friend who could not really be trusted with scissors, and that was exactly the intention. The whole decade had been about hair as a kind of glory, long and feathered and blow-dried to perfection. Hours of work poured into looking effortlessly beautiful. So these kids hacked theirs off short and jagged and dyed it colours that occur nowhere in nature, and the message was unmistakable. We are not trying to be beautiful for you. We are trying to be free. And it worked, in the way that only real style works, by getting under people's skin. Grown-ups were genuinely upset by it, which delighted everyone to no end. Walk down the street looking like this and you would get the stares, the muttered comments, the shopkeepers watching you a little too closely. But that friction was the whole fun of it. When the entire point of your look is that you refuse to blend in, every scandalized glance is a small confirmation that the thing is working exactly as designed. There was, underneath the shock of it, a real and stubborn kind of honesty. The clothes did not pretend to be anything they were not. There was no glamour here, no illusion, no expensive costume dressing up an ordinary life as something grander. It was the opposite. It was a whole generation of the young people insisting on being seen exactly as they were, broken, restless and unimpressed, and refusing to paper over any of it. In a decade absolutely swimming in polish and pretense, that plain refusal to pretend was its own kind of radical act. And it was inventive, endlessly, gloriously inventive. Without any money at all, these kids became some of the most creative dressers the century produced, precisely because they had nothing to work with but imagination and a needle and thread and whatever the thrift store had on the rack that week. No two of them looked quite alike. That was the rule that mattered most. You were not supposed to copy an outfit out of a magazine. You were supposed to invent yourself from the boots up into someone who had never existed before. We have circled back to it 100 times since, of course. The safety pins and the torn edges and the homemade defiance have all been sold back to us many times over, polished up and put on a rack with a price tag, which is a joke the original kids would have appreciated. But the true spirit of it can never really be bottled and sold, because the spirit was never in the clothes at all. It was in the decision. It was in a young person standing in front of a mirror, scissors in hand, deciding to become something new that very night, with no money and no permission, and no idea what came next. That decision, made in 1,000 bathrooms across the country, was the most stylish thing about the entire decade. Now let us drive out of the city, up into the hills, to visit something that is quietly ending. The communes that bloomed at the tail of the 1960s are still here in the early 70s, but the light has changed. The garden still needs weeding. The bread still rises in the same dented pans. But some of the faces around that long wooden table have begun to wonder, softly, whether the dream can really pay the electric bill. There is a tenderness in watching a beautiful idea grow tired, in the way people hold on just a little longer than the moment lasts. It is one of the gentlest goodbyes the whole decade had to offer. The land is still beautiful, that has not changed. The morning fog still lifts off the fields the way it did the first summer, and the vegetable rows still run down toward the trees, and the goats still need milking whether anyone feels inspired or not. In the early light it can still look exactly like the dream it was meant to be, a handful of people living simply and honestly off the land, sharing everything, answering to nobody. On a good morning, you can stand at the edge of the garden with a cup of coffee and believe the whole thing is going to last forever. But the work was always harder than anyone said it would be. That was the truth the posters never mentioned. The garden that looked so romantic in June was a merciless taskmaster in the heat of August, and the animals didn't care about your philosophy, and the well ran low, and the roof leaked, and somebody had to fix it, and increasingly it was the same few somebodies fixing everything while the others drifted. Living off the land turned out to be a full-time job that never once clocked out, and idealism, it turned out, did not pull weeds. There were the money troubles too, always circling. You could grow a great deal of what you ate, but you could not grow the money for the property tax, or the truck repair, or the medicine when one of the children got sick in the winter. So somebody had to go into town and take a job, an ordinary job, the very kind of thing they had all come up here to escape, and that quiet compromise sat heavily on the whole household. The dream had been to step outside the system entirely. The reality was that the system still sent a bill, and the people changed as people do. The ones who had thrown themselves into it hardest sometimes burned out hardest, worn down by the endless labour and the crowded quarters, and the difficulty of sharing every single thing with every single person, day after day, with no door you could close. Old friends grew short with each other over small matters, whose turn it was who had not done their share. Nobody had come here to keep score, and yet the scores kept themselves anyway, quietly, in everyone's tired hearts. Still they held on, and there is something so moving in the holding on, because it had been real, whatever else it was. There had been mornings of pure joy, whole seasons of them, meals eaten together under the trees, music around the fire, children raised by a dozen loving hands, a genuine and tender experiment in living a different and gentler way. Nobody wanted to be the first to say out loud that it might be over. So instead they weeded the garden one more time, and baked the bread one more time, and sat around the long table one more evening, holding the moment a little past its ending, the way you linger in a doorway saying goodbye to someone you love. You can feel it in the air on an evening like this, that soft awareness that the season is turning. Somebody has mentioned, carefully, that they might head back to the city in the fall to finish school, to see about a job. Nobody argues, everybody understands. And that understanding is its own kind of grace, the way these people who had dreamed such a big dream together now let each other go without bitterness, one by one, back into the ordinary world they had tried so hard to leave behind. It would be easy to call it a failure, but that would be missing the whole point. They had tried. In a world that told them exactly how they were supposed to live, they had said no, and gone up into the hills and built something else with their own hands, and lived inside it for a while, and loved it. That it did not last forever does not make it a failure. Most beautiful things do not last forever. The garden goes to seed, the fog burns off, the friends move on. But they carried something down out of those hills that stayed with them all their lives, a memory of a time when they believed the world could be made kinder and simpler, and had the courage, however briefly, to go and try. For some, the dream did not end. It simply got in the van and kept driving. All across the country there were people who arranged their entire lives around a band, chasing the tour from one town to the next, sleeping in parking lots, trading cassette tapes of old shows like sacred texts. The lot outside the venue became its own little travelling city, all patchouli and grilled cheese and hand-lettered signs. You did not go for the destination. You went to be among your people, the ones who understood without your having to explain. There is something in that devotion, that willingness to follow a feeling across state lines, that feels almost impossible now. The band was never really the whole of it, though of course the band was the reason. The music was the sun that this little solar system spun around, But the true gravity was the people, the same faces turning up show after show, town after town, until the crowd stopped being a crowd and became something much more like a family. You would pull into a lot in a city you'd never seen and immediately spot a van you recognised, a bumper sticker, a familiar dog, a friend you had last seen 4 states ago, and it was like coming home to a home that had wheels. The parking lot before the show was a world unto itself, and for many it was the best part of the whole night. It sprawled and hummed and filled with wood smoke, a pop-up village that assembled itself in an afternoon and vanished by dawn. People sold what they had made to fund the road to the next town: grilled cheese sandwiches off a camp stove, beaded jewellery, tie-dyed shirts drying on a line strung between 2 cars. You could wander the rows for hours, and everyone had a story, and everyone had time to tell it, and nobody was in any particular hurry to be anywhere but exactly here. The road itself was hard, and nobody who lived it would tell you otherwise. There was never quite enough money, and the van was always one strange noise away from disaster, and you slept where you could, folded across a seat or stretched out under the stars in a field behind the venue. You ate poorly and washed rarely, and lived a life your parents could not begin to understand. But you were free in a way that most people only dream about, unhooked from the clock and the calendar, following nothing but the music and the map and the company of people who wanted the same wild thing you did. The tapes were the sacred currency of the whole world. Somebody always had a recorder rolling at every show, and afterward the recordings passed from hand to hand and van to van, traded and copied and treasured, each one a little piece of a night that would never come again. You could sit in a parking lot 1,000 miles and 6 months away from a particular show and press play and be right back inside it, and the people around you would go quiet and lean in, because they had been there too, or wished they had. It was a way of holding on to the unholdable, of keeping a night alive long after it should have faded. And underneath it all ran that current of belonging, which was really the thing everyone was chasing. Out in the ordinary world, these were people who had been told, in 100 small ways, that they did not quite fit. Too strange, too dreamy, too unwilling to fall in line and get a sensible job and want the sensible things. But out here on the road, among their own, all of that flipped inside out. Here they were not the misfits. Here they were exactly right, understood without a word of explanation, welcomed by people who had been searching for the very same thing. The show itself, when it finally came, was a kind of church. The lights went down, and the first notes rose up, and the whole room, this family that had gathered from every corner of the country, moved and swayed as one body. Nobody stood still. Nobody watched from the edges. You gave yourself over to it completely, to the music and the crowd and the sweet certainty that for these few hours you were exactly where you were meant to be, with exactly the people you were meant to be with. Then the show ended, and the lot broke down, and the vans pulled out one by one into the dark, headlights swinging toward the next town on the list. And the beautiful thing, the almost unbelievable thing, is that they would do it all again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, for as long as the road and the band and their own restless hearts would let them. It was a devotion that asked for everything and paid back in a coin the ordinary world does not mint, and those who spent their youth that way, chasing a feeling from town to town, mostly do not regret a single mile of it. Back in the clubs, a different kind of rebellion was shining under the lights. This one wore glitter on its cheekbones and satin on its shoulders, and stood a full 6 inches taller than nature intended. Glam didn't whisper. It arrived in platform boots, painted its face, and dared you to say a single word about it. The boys wore feathers, the girls wore lightning bolts, and everyone wore the thrilling idea that a person could simply invent themselves from the skin outward, In a decade still nervous about a great many things, that turned out to be a quietly radical gift. It began, like so much of the decade did, with a refusal. The world of that time had very firm ideas about who was allowed to sparkle. Glitter and satin and paint were meant for certain people, and certainly not for others, and the boundaries were policed with 100 small cruelties. So a handful of brave and beautiful souls looked at all those rules and simply stepped straight over them, out onto the stage and into the light, dressed in everything they had been told they could not wear, and they looked absolutely magnificent, and they knew it. The platform boots were the throne of the whole thing, and what a throne they were. They lifted you up out of the ordinary crowd, made you walk differently, carefully, grandly, like someone who knew the world was watching and had decided to give it a show worth watching. They were impractical to the point of comedy, murder on the ankles, and nobody who wore them cared one bit, because they were never about walking. They were about arriving. They were about being unmissable the moment you came through the door. And the faces, oh, the faces were canvases. Everyone became their own work of art, painting on colours and stars and lightning bolts, drawing the person they wished to be right onto the person they were. There was a magic in the transformation, a genuine alchemy in sitting down before a mirror as one thing and rising up as another. The makeup was not a mask to hide behind. It was quite the opposite. It was a truer self, brought up to the surface and made visible at last, brighter and bolder and more honest than the plain, ordinary face the daylight demanded. What made it all so quietly powerful was the idea humming underneath, an idea that seems almost obvious now but was electric then, that you were not stuck with the self you had been handed. You could be anyone. You could invent yourself fresh, from the boots to the eyelids, and the invention was as real and valid as anything you were born with. For every kid who had ever felt trapped inside the wrong expectations, who had ever sensed there was a more dazzling version of themselves locked away somewhere, this was a revelation and a door thrown open at once. The clubs where all this glittered were sanctuaries, rooms where the ordinary rules were suspended for a few precious hours. Out on the street you might have to be careful, had to fold yourself down small to get through the day unbothered. But inside, under those lights, among your own kind, you could unfold completely, stretch out into your full 6-inch heeled glory, and be met not with sneers, but with delighted recognition. There is no describing what that kind of room means to someone who has never been allowed one. It was oxygen. It was permission. It was home. And it was fun. Gloriously, unapologetically fun, which is a thing the history books tend to forget when they get solemn about its meaning. It was a joy to dress up like that. It was a thrill to be that bold, to catch the light, to turn every head, to feel beautiful and outrageous and completely alive. There was laughter in it and mischief, and the pure childlike delight of playing dress-up made grand and real. The rebellion never felt grim. It felt like a party because it was one. The lightning bolt was the perfect little sign of the whole thing. A jolt of electricity worn right on the skin. A promise of energy and change and a refusal to sit quietly in the dark. That was what glam offered anyone brave enough to take it. A jolt, a spark, a sudden bright permission to become. It burned fast, as the brightest things tend to, but it lit something in a great many people that never entirely went out, and every time since that someone has stood before a mirror and decided tonight to be dazzling, they have been drawing on a courage that these glittering pioneers wore first, up on a stage, dressed as their own truest and most radiant selves. Let us step into the stranger store in town, the one with the beaded curtain in the doorway and the smell of incense that reaches you out on the sidewalk. Inside, black light posters glow purple on the walls, and the ceiling drips with wind chimes and things you cannot quite name. The fellow behind the counter is in no hurry about anything at all. There are records here, and pipes, and rolling papers, and a rack of underground comics, and the vague, pleasant sense that the ordinary rules of retail have been gently suspended. Every town had one, tucked between the barber and the laundromat, a little pocket of the counterculture stubbornly keeping its lights on. The beaded curtain in the doorway was the first sign that you had crossed over into somewhere else. It swayed and clicked as you pushed through it, and on the other side the whole ordinary world seemed to fall away behind you. The light was different in here, dim and coloured and dreamlike, and the air was thick with sandalwood, and time itself appeared to move a little slower than it did out on the sidewalk. You were only one step off the main street, but you might as well have walked into another country. The posters were a wonder all their own, and you could lose a whole afternoon just looking at them. In the ordinary light they were vivid enough, but the shop had rigged up those black lights in the back corner, and under that strange purple glow the posters came alive, blazing with colours that seemed to hum right off the paper. Swirling patterns, impossible landscapes, images that shifted the longer you stared. Kids would stand back there for the longest time, heads tilted, mouths open, and nobody behind the counter ever rushed them along. And that was the thing about the fellow behind the counter, that magnificent, unhurried calm. He was in no rush to sell you anything, no rush to do much of anything at all. He might be reading, or listening to a record with his eyes half closed, or deep in a slow, rambling conversation with a regular about something that had no beginning and no end. When you came up with a question, he would consider it seriously, unhurriedly, as though it were a matter of real weight. In a world speeding up on every side, the head shop ran on its own gentle time, and stepping into it was like stepping into a held breath. The merchandise itself was a glorious jumble, a treasure hunt with no map. Records leaned in crates on the floor, the kind you could not find at the regular stores in the mall. There were incense sticks in 100 cents and little brass burners to hold them. There were patches and pins and rolling papers and beads and candles and tapestries hung on the walls and a spinning rack of underground comics full of ideas that would never in 1,000 years have made it onto the television. Everything in the place seemed to have wandered in from somewhere more interesting than here. Those underground comics were a small revolution folded up on a wire rack. This was an age when most of what you could read or watch had been smoothed and sanded down to offend absolutely no one. And here were these cheap, smudgy little books saying whatever they pleased, drawn by outsiders for outsiders, funny and strange and often deeply peculiar. For a young person hungry for something real, something that had not been focus grouped into blandness, that rack was a window into a whole world where the truth was told a little more crookedly and a lot more honestly. The head shop mattered more than its modest storefront ever let on, because it was one of the few places the counterculture kept a permanent address. So much of that whole world was fleeting, a concert, a gathering, a moment that came and went. But the head shop stayed. It was there on Monday morning and Thursday afternoon, lights on, incense burning, a fixed point you could return to. For the scattered dreamers of any given town, the ones who felt the pull of something larger than the life laid out for them, it was a lighthouse, quietly signalling that they were not alone, that the wider, strange, beautiful world had planted a small outpost right here between the barber and the laundromat. And so you would go, even when you had no money to spend, just to be inside it for a while, just to flip through the records and read the comics and breathe the sandalwood air and feel the ordinary rules loosen their grip. You would talk to the fellow behind the counter or you would not, and either was fine. Then eventually you would push back out through the beaded curtain into the hard, bright light of the regular street, blinking, a little changed, carrying a small, quiet reminder that there were other ways to be in the world. Those little shops are mostly gone now, and something soft and strange and welcoming went out of our towns when they closed their doors for the last time. Out in the parking lot, parked at a deliberate angle so you cannot help but admire it, sits the true castle of the 1970s, the custom van. From the outside it wears an airbrushed mural, a wizard or an eagle, or a desert sunset painted by somebody's cousin over 3 long weekends. Slide open the door and the whole world softens, shag carpet running up the walls, a little bed, coloured porch lights, maybe an 8-track deck murmuring in the corner. It was freedom you could park in the driveway. It was privacy you could drive out to the lake. There has honestly never been anything quite so gloriously, unapologetically groovy since. It started life, most of them, as the plainest thing imaginable, a boxy work van, the kind a plumber or a florist might drive, all bare metal and rattling emptiness inside. And that blank plainness was exactly the appeal, because it was a canvas, an empty room on wheels waiting to become whatever its owner could dream up. Somebody looked at that dull white delivery van and saw a palace, a hideaway, a rolling expression of everything they were, and then spent every spare weekend and every spare dollar slowly making it real. The outside was where you announced yourself to the world, and nobody held back. The murals were extraordinary, whole fantastical scenes airbrushed across the flanks of the van in colours that caught the sun and threw it back. A wizard raising a staff against a stormy sky, an eagle with its wings spread across the whole side panel, a desert at sunset, or a galaxy, or a rearing horse, or a scene out of some paperback fantasy novel. It took real skill and real patience, and the person who owned that van was rightly proud of every brushstroke, because it was theirs, one of a kind, rolling down the highway where the whole world could see. But the true magic was on the inside, and you did not know the half of it until that side door slid open. The bare metal box was gone, transformed utterly. Shag carpet, thick and soft, ran not just across the floor but up the walls and over the ceiling, so the whole space felt warm and hushed and cushioned, like the inside of a jewellery box. There was often a bed built in at the back, and little cabinets, and curtains on the windows for privacy. Some had a small refrigerator, or a table, or captain's chairs up front that swivelled around to face the room. It was a tiny home you could drive anywhere at all. And then there were the lights, because no van was truly finished without them. Little coloured bulbs strung along the ceiling, casting the whole interior in soft reds and blues and greens, so that at night the inside of the van glowed like a small warm cave in the darkness. Somebody had wired in an 8-track deck, and it sat there murmuring your favourite music into that cushioned, coloured, carpeted space, and there was frankly nowhere on earth you would rather be. It was a room built entirely for pleasure and comfort and being exactly yourself, and you had built it, and it moved. That was the deep genius of the whole thing, the freedom it put right in your hands. A young person did not have much room of their own in those days. You lived with your parents, or you lived in some cramped apartment with too many roommates and paper-thin walls. But the van was yours completely. It was a room nobody else controlled, and better than any room, it had wheels. You could climb in on a Friday evening and simply drive, out of town, up the coast, to the lake, to the mountains, to wherever the road felt like taking you, and everything you needed to be comfortable came right along. It became the setting for 1,000 small adventures. You drove it out to the lake and parked at the water's edge and slept to the sound of the waves. You took it to the concert and made it your base camp in the lot. You loaded it up with friends and drove through the night, the coloured lights glowing, the music playing, The whole warm world of it sealed off from the cold, indifferent dark outside. Wherever you took it, you took a little pocket of home along, and there is a freedom in that which is hard to find any other way. We do not build things quite like this anymore, and something has been lost in that. The van was gloriously impractical and completely unnecessary and wonderful precisely because of it. Nobody needed shag carpet on the ceiling. Nobody needed an airbrushed wizard on the door. They wanted it, and they built it anyway, pouring their weekends and their dollars and their whole personalities into a rolling room that made them happy. That was the spirit of the thing, and honestly the spirit of the whole decade. A willingness to make ordinary life a good deal more colourful than it strictly had to be, just for the pure groovy joy of it. Now roll down the highway and switch on the radio that talks back. The oil crisis has dropped the speed limit to 55. The truckers are restless, and out of all that boredom and rebellion comes a whole secret language crackling across the citizens' band. Everyone has a handle now, a nickname for the airwaves, and a housewife in a station wagon can warn a total stranger about the trouble waiting over the next hill. It was a social network built out of static and slang, decades before anyone thought to call it that. For a few short years, the loneliest stretch of road in America was somehow the most talkative place in the country. The radio itself sat bolted under the dashboard, a small box with a coiled cord and a microphone you held up to your mouth like a stage singer. You clicked the button on the side and the whole invisible neighbourhood of the highway could hear you, and you could hear them. A crackling chorus of voices riding along on the same long ribbon of road. It cost you nothing to talk. That was part of the wonder of it. In an age when a long-distance telephone call was a small fortune, here was a way to chatter freely with strangers for hours, and the only price was a little static. The language was the joy of it, a whole vocabulary that sprang up almost overnight, and half the fun was learning to speak it. The police became bears, hiding in the weeds. A traffic jam was a parking lot. Your location was your 20. If you wanted to talk, you asked for somebody's ears, and when you signed off you said you were putting the hammer down, or that you had wall-to-wall and treetop tall, and you knew, saying it, that you had joined something, that you spoke the tongue of the road now and belonged. The truckers were the lords of this country, and everyone else was a happy guest. They had been out there all along, of course, running their long hauls through the night, keeping each other company across the empty dark hours when the rest of the world was asleep. They warned each other about the bears with the radar, and the accidents up ahead, and the good places to stop and eat. They passed the loneliness back and forth between them like a thermos of coffee, and now, suddenly, the ordinary drivers wanted in on it too. And the ordinary drivers came pouring onto the airwaves by the millions, which was the strangest and sweetest part of the whole phenomenon. Suddenly the family in the wood-panelled station wagon had a handle. Grandma had a handle. The salesman driving his lonely route between towns had a handle, and a voice, and a whole cast of invisible companions to see him down the road. People who had never in their lives have spoken to one another found themselves chatting like old friends, warning each other of dangers, trading jokes, easing one another's long hours behind the wheel. There was a real democracy to it, a genuine levelling that felt almost magical. On the citizens' band, nobody could see you. Nobody knew what you drove or what you wore or what you looked like or how much money you had. You were only a voice and a handle, judged on nothing but your words and your wit. A shy person could be bold out there. A lonely person could be surrounded. The masks the ordinary world made everyone wear all day simply fell away in the static, and people met each other for once as nothing more or less than voices in the dark. It fed something deep in people, this talking, and I think that is why it caught fire the way it did. The highway is a lonely place, all that empty asphalt unspooling toward a horizon that never gets closer, and the human heart was never built for that much silence and solitude. So when a way appeared to fill that emptiness with voices, with company, with the warm reassurance that other souls were out there in the dark rolling along beside you, people reached for it with both hands. They were not really talking about the bears and the parking lots. They were talking because it is a hard and beautiful thing to be a human alone on a long road at night, and a voice on the radio made it bearable. For a few short years it was everywhere, this crackling invisible town that stretched from coast to coast, and then, as these things do, it faded. The speed limit stopped mattering so much, and the novelty wore thin, and eventually other ways of reaching one another came along and pulled everyone's attention off the airwaves and onto smaller, glowing screens. The radios came out of the dashboards. The handles were forgotten. The great talkative highway went quiet again, but those who rode it in its heyday remember it fondly, and they were onto something the rest of us would only understand much later. They had built, out of nothing but static and slang, and the simple human wish not to be alone, a whole network of strangers reaching across the dark to keep each other company. We do a version of that now all day on devices in our pockets, and we act as though we invented it. We did not. It was there first, crackling out of a little box under the dashboard, on the loneliest road in America, when a stranger's voice saying breaker was the friendliest sound in the world. Let us head west now, to a scorched corner of Southern California, where the water has run out and something wonderful has rushed in to fill the space. There is a drought on, and the swimming pools of empty houses sit drained and curving and irresistible. A pack of kids on brand new urethane wheels have figured out that a pool is really just a wave that holds still, and they are learning to ride the walls of them, higher and higher, inventing a sport in real time. They skate the cracked schoolyards and the concrete banks by day, and get chased off by nightfall. Nobody important is watching yet. That is precisely what makes it so pure. The wheels were the whole thing, the small secret that changed everything. For years the boards had rolled on hard clay wheels that skittered and stuck and threw you off at the first pebble in your path. Then somebody thought to make them out of a soft new material, and suddenly the wheels gripped and rolled smooth and fast and quiet, and held the concrete through a turn instead of sliding out from under you. It seems like such a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. It was the difference between a toy and a whole new way to move through the world. And these kids, these particular sun-browned kids from the flat and dusty edge of the city, took that small change and ran with it further than anyone imagined. They had grown up on surfboards, most of them, riding the waves out past the pier, and they brought the whole feeling of it up onto the land. They skated low and loose, one hand trailing, knees bent, carving long lazy lines down the sidewalk as though the pavement itself were water. They were not just rolling along, they were surfing the streets, and they knew it, and it looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. The drought was the strange gift that opened the door. All over that dry corner of California, the water grew scarce and the pools ran dry, and the ones behind empty foreclosed houses sat drained and forgotten in the heat. A drained swimming pool is a peculiar and beautiful shape when you really look at it. A smooth, curving bowl of concrete, the walls sweeping up gently from the flat bottom. And one day some kid stood at the edge of one of those empty pools and looked down into that curve and understood, in a flash, that it was a wave that had been holding still, waiting all this time for someone to ride it. So they rode it. They dropped down into those empty pools and skated up the curving walls, higher each time, learning by falling and getting up and falling again what the concrete would let them do. It was trespassing technically, and often literally, and half the adventure was the hunt itself, cruising the neighbourhoods in search of the next empty pool, peering over fences, knocking on doors, bailing out the last of the rainwater with buckets and coffee cans just for the chance to ride. When the owner or the police turned up, you grabbed your board and ran, laughing, hearts pounding, already scheming about the next one. By day, when there were no pools to be found, they skated everything else the dry world offered up. The schoolyards were full of gentle concrete banks meant for nothing in particular, and the kids found them and made them theirs. The drainage ditches, the loading docks, the smooth curving lips of any bit of poured concrete, a city leaves lying around. All of it became a playground the moment you looked at it with a skater's eyes. They saw possibility everywhere the rest of the world saw only pavement, and that shift in seeing was its own kind of magic. What makes it all shine so brightly in memory is that nobody was watching yet. There was no money in it, no fame, no cameras, no grown-up telling them how it ought to be done. It was pure in the way that only a thing invented by kids for their own delight can be pure. They were making it up as they went, purely for the joy of the doing, answerable to no one, driven by nothing but the thrill of rolling up a concrete wall a few inches higher than they had the day before. That is about as free as a young person ever gets to be. Of course, the watching came later, as it always does. The world eventually noticed what those kids were doing in the empty pools, and it grew into something enormous, something with contests and stars and equipment, and a whole industry humming behind it. But on these dusty afternoons, in this scorched and drought-stricken corner of California, none of that has arrived yet. There are only the kids, and the boards, and the drained curving pools, and the long golden light, and the beautiful private certainty that they have stumbled onto something wonderful that belongs for now entirely to them. Some of the sweetest moments in any story are the ones right before the world finds out. Not far from those empty pools, the older brothers and sisters are still doing it the original way, out past the pier where the real waves are. Surf culture had already had its golden noon, but here in the 70s it settles into something quieter and more devoted. You wax the board in the grey light before dawn, paddle out through the cold, and then wait, bobbing, for the ocean to decide. The reward might last all of 10 seconds. It is enough. There is a patience the ocean teaches that the rest of the decade, in all its glorious noise, never quite managed to learn. The morning began in the dark, and that was the first devotion the ocean asked of you. While the rest of the world slept, you were up pulling on the cold, damp wetsuit, loading the board onto the car in the blue-grey hush before sunrise. There was no glory in that hour, no audience, nobody to see how dedicated you were. There was only you and the pull of the water, strong enough to drag you out of a warm bed and down to the shore while the town still slept. That solitary early rising was a kind of promise you made to the sea, over and over, and the sea knew who kept it. Down at the water's edge you waxed the board, kneeling on the cold sand, running the block over the deck in slow circles until the surface gripped. It was a small ritual, done 1,000 times, and there was a meditation in it, a settling of the mind before the work of the water began. The waves were already breaking out there in the dimness, that low, steady rumble and hush that surfers hear in their sleep for the rest of their lives, and you listened to them as you waxed, reading their mood, feeling out what kind of morning the ocean had decided to give you. Then came the paddle out, and the paddle out was hard, always hard, harder than anyone who has not done it can quite imagine. You lay flat on the board and stroked out through the cold grey water, and the waves came in against you, and you punched through them one after another, ducking under the white water, fighting for every yard. By the time you reached the calm water beyond the break, your arms burned and your lungs heaved, and you had earned, through plain effort, the right to be out there at all. The ocean did not hand you anything. It made you work for the smallest piece of it. And then, after all that labour, you waited. That was the great secret of the whole thing. The part that never made it into the bright, cheerful movies. Most of surfing was simply sitting on your board in the swell, bobbing gently, watching the horizon, waiting for the ocean to decide to send you something worth riding. You could wait a long time. You floated out there in the vast, cold quiet, the shore small and distant behind you, the sky slowly lightening, and you learned a patience that the frantic, honking world back on land had entirely forgotten how to feel. But the waiting was not empty. That was the thing the surfers understood that the rest of us mostly missed. Out there past the break, in that floating hush, a person came to know a kind of peace that could not be found anywhere on shore. The gentle rise and fall of the swell beneath you, the salt smell of it, and the cold, clean air, and the sun finally lifting over the hills to lay a sheet of gold across the water. The pelicans skimming past in a line, the world reduced to sky and sea and your own quiet breathing. Even if no good wave ever came, that stillness alone was worth the cold paddle out. And then, at last, one came. You felt it before you saw it, a swell rising up out of the deep, gathering itself, marching toward you, and you turned the board and paddled hard to match its speed, and at the perfect instant you felt it lift and take you, and you were up, on your feet, sliding down the face of a moving mountain of water. For a few seconds, a handful of glorious seconds, you flew. All that cold, all that labour, all that patient waiting distilled itself into those few seconds of pure gliding motion, and there was nothing else in the whole world, and it was more than enough. 10 seconds, and then the wave closed out and spilled you into the foam, and you climbed back onto your board and paddled out to do it all again. That was the whole strange bargain of it. Hours of cold and effort and waiting for a few fleeting seconds of grace, and everyone who lived it will tell you the bargain was more than fair. The ocean taught its devotees to value the moment precisely because the moment was so brief, to earn their joy and then hold it lightly and let it go. It was a lesson the loud, hurried, grasping decade badly needed, whispered out past the pier every morning to whoever cared enough to rise in the dark and paddle out and listen. Come back inland now to the wide main drag of almost any town, the moment the work week finally lets go. This is cruising, the great weekend ritual of American youth, engines idling low, windows down, the same slow loop from one end of the boulevard to the other and back again. In the barrios of the southwest, the lowriders take it to an art form, the cars dropped low and gleaming, murals across the hoods, hydraulics making them bow and bounce at a red light. You're not really going anywhere. You're being seen and seeing and letting the whole warm night unspool at 15 miles an hour. It was a stage made of asphalt, and everybody had a part to play. The car was everything, and the whole week bent toward this night. You spent your Saturday afternoons washing it, waxing it, tuning it, saving your money for the part that would make it shine a little brighter than the rest. It was more than transportation. It was your calling card, your costume, the way you announced to the whole boulevard exactly who you were and how you wished to be seen. Some kids poured every spare dollar and every free hour into their cars, and when they finally rolled onto the strip on a Friday night, gleaming and rumbling, all that work paid itself back in a single, slow, triumphant loop. The loop itself was the whole architecture of the evening, a simple ritual everyone understood without ever being told. You drove the length of the main drag, slow, windows down, then you turned around and drove it back, and then you did it again and again all night long. Round and round the same familiar stretch of road, past the drive-in and the drugstore and the knots of kids gathered on the corners. It sounds like it should have been boring, that endless circling, and it was the furthest thing from boring. Because the road was never the point. The people on it were the point. Because the boulevard on a Friday night was where everyone was, and that was the beating heart of the thing. This was the meeting place, the town square with a soundtrack. The one spot where the whole restless young population of the town gathered to see and be seen. You cruised slow so you could look and be looked at, so you could pull up alongside a car full of friends at a red light and lean out the window and talk. You called out to the kids on the sidewalk and they called back. Word of a party travelled the strip car to car. Whole friendships and romances began at 15 miles an hour, window to window in the warm summer dark. And in the barrios of the southwest, cruising rose to something close to high art, and the lowriders were its masterpieces. These were cars built with a love and a patience that took your breath away, dropped low to the ground, polished until they threw the streetlights back like mirrors, painted with murals that ran across the hoods and trunks in colours deep as jewels. The owners had worked over every inch of them, and it showed, and the whole community understood exactly what it was looking at when one rolled past, slow and proud and gleaming. It was a rolling gallery, a family's pride and a neighbourhood's proud made visible. The hydraulics were the showstopper, the flourish that made the crowd gasp and grin. A driver would pull up to a red light, and with the flick of a switch the whole car would drop and rise and bow, dip its nose to the pavement, bounce and hop and dance right there at the intersection, while everyone watching hollered their approval. It was pure spectacle, pure joy. A car doing something no car was ever built to do, and it turned an ordinary stoplight into a stage and a performance. There was showmanship in it, and skill, and a deep glad delight in bringing a little astonishment to a warm Friday night. The sounds and the smells of it all still live vividly in the memory of anyone who was there. The low burble of the engines idling, the music pouring out of a dozen different radios, blending and clashing and blending again as the cars rolled past one another, the smell of exhaust and of somebody's cologne and of French fries drifting over from the drive-in, the warm night air moving through the open windows. It was a feast for every sense, the whole boulevard alive and rumbling and glowing under the streetlights, and being out in the middle of it was to feel powerfully that you were young and alive and exactly where you belonged. That is the thing that has grown so hard to find, and the thing worth honouring here. Cruising the boulevard was young people simply gathering, in the flesh, in one shared place, to be together, face to face, window to window, for no reason but the pleasure of each other's company. There was no hurry, no destination, no purpose beyond the being there, just the slow loop and the warm night and the whole community of the young rolling round and round beneath the streetlights, seeing and being seen, letting an ordinary Friday stretch itself out into something none of them would ever forget. Let us duck out of the weather into the true clubhouse of the entire decade, the record store. The bins stretch back into the dim, and you walk your fingers through them, flipping album after album, reading the backs, memorizing the credits. The clerk behind the counter guards his taste like a dragon on a hoard, and will judge your choices gently, which is honestly part of the service. Somebody's new record is playing overhead, and half the store is quietly trying to figure out what it is. Before playlists, before previews, before any of it, this is where you went to find your tribe, one cardboard sleeve at a time. The flipping was the whole rhythm of the place, and everyone did it. That steady rustling clatter of album after album tipping forward under your fingers as you worked your way down a bin. There was no hurry to it. You could spend an entire afternoon in there, working through the racks methodically, one at a time, and it never once felt like a waste of an afternoon. Each album you flipped past was a small decision, a tiny yes or no, and the pleasure was in the flipping itself, in the slow, patient hunt for something you did not even know you were looking for until you found it. The covers were half the magic, and you cannot explain this to anyone who only ever knew music as something small and glowing on a screen. The album cover was a foot square, a real object you held in your two hands, a piece of art in its own right. Some of them were strange, some beautiful, some baffling, and you would stand there studying one for whole minutes, turning it over, reading every word on the back, memorizing the names of the musicians and the studios and the songs. The cover made a promise about the music inside, and half the thrill was carrying it home and finding out whether the promise held. The clerk behind the counter was the presiding spirit of the temple, and every good record store had one. He knew everything, or acted as though he did, and he guarded his opinions with a fierce and jealous pride. He would glance at what you carried up to the counter and let a small judgment flicker across his face, approval or disappointment, and somehow you cared about that judgment more than you would ever admit. But he knew his stuff truly, and if you got on his good side, he would steer you toward things you had never heard of, pull an album from the bin and press it into your hands and say, "Trust me." And you did. The music playing overhead was its own quiet game, running all day long. The clerk always had something spinning, and it was usually something you didn't recognize, and the whole store would be half listening, wondering, working up the nerve to go and ask what it was. That was how you found half the best music of your life, standing in a record store, catching something wonderful over the speakers and going up to the counter to learn its name. There were no other ways to hear it. You could not summon it up from thin air. You had to be there, in the room, ears open, ready to be surprised, and the store was where the tribe gathered, which was maybe the deepest thing about it. The people who loved music the way you loved it, who took it as seriously as you did, they came here too, and you saw the same faces, and you fell into conversations in the aisles about a band or an album or a show. You could tell a great deal about a stranger by what they carried to the counter. Whole friendships began over a shared enthusiasm discovered between the bins. It was a gathering place for a scattered kind of people, the ones for whom music was not just background, but a whole way of feeling their way through the world. There was a patience the record store asked of you that we have largely lost, and looking back it seems like a gift rather than a burden. You could not have everything at once. You could not sample 100 songs in a minute and keep the one you liked. You saved your money, and you chose carefully, one album at a time, and that scarcity made each record precious. You brought it home and you listened to the whole thing, both sides, all the way through, over and over, until you knew every note. You gave it your full attention, because it had cost you something to get it, and in return it gave you back far more than anything you can have for free. Those stores are mostly gone now, or nearly so, and something went out of the world when their doors closed for good. The music itself is everywhere now, endless, instant, weightless, and that is a wonder in its own way, and I would not truly wish it back. But we lost the room. We lost the bins and the covers and the clerk and the music drifting down from overhead, and the gathering of the tribe and the slow patient afternoons spent flipping through the racks hunting for treasure. We lost the temple and its patient rituals, and for those who worshipped there, the memory of it is warm and clear and precious still. Now let us turn the volume all the way up, because the funk simply will not be ignored. In the cities, the block parties spill out of the community centres and into the street. The bass so deep you feel it in your chest. The horns so bright they seem to lift the heat right off the pavement. Somebody has run a cord out a window to power the speakers, and the whole neighbourhood is out on the stoop, dancing, laughing, grilling, alive. This was music built for a crowd, for a body, for a summer night. You could not stand still in it if you tried, and the beautiful thing is that nobody ever really tried. It began with the bass, always the bass, that deep round rolling pulse that you did not so much hear as feel, right in the centre of your chest. Funk was built from the ground up, from the low end, from the beat, music made for the body before it was ever made for the ear. The bass line walked and bounced and locked in tight with the drums, and together they laid down a groove so solid and so deep that your feet started moving before your mind had voted on the matter. That was the whole design of it. It bypassed your thinking entirely and spoke straight to your hips. And over that deep foundation came the horns, blazing, joyful, cutting through the summer air like sunlight through a cloud. A whole section of them, trumpets and saxophones, hitting those bright sharp stabs all together, tight as a fist, then peeling off into runs that made you grin from ear to ear. The horns were the celebration riding on top of the groove, the pure, exuberant joy of it. And when they hit all at once on the downbeat, you felt the whole crowd lift a little off the pavement together. It was heat and light and jubilation, poured straight out of the speakers into the street. The block party was the natural home of it, and there was nothing else quite like a block party in full swing. Somebody had the sound system, and somebody ran a long orange cord out through a first-floor window to power it. And just like that, the whole street became the dance floor. There was no ticket, no door, no cover charge, no velvet rope. The party was simply there, out in the open, free to anyone who lived on the block or wandered onto it, and the whole neighbourhood turned out for it, from the smallest kids to the oldest grandmothers watching from lawn chairs on the stoop. And everyone was welcome, and everyone came, and that was the deep beauty of it. This was music that gathered a whole community into one place and set it moving as one body. The old folks and the young folks, the shy and the bold, the ones who could really dance and the ones who could not dance a lick, all of them out in the street together under the summer sky. Somebody was grilling, and the smell of it drifted through the crowd. Somebody's grandmother was keeping time with her hand on the arm of a chair. Little kids darted through the legs of the dancers. It was the whole neighbourhood, all of it, alive and together and glad. You could not stand still, and nobody wanted to, and there was a permission in that which felt like pure joy. The groove reached out and took hold of everyone, and self-consciousness simply melted away in the heat and the noise and the crowd. Out there in the street, dancing among your neighbours, you did not worry about how you looked. Everyone was moving. Everyone was sweating and grinning and giving themselves over to the music, and there was no room left for embarrassment, only for the shared, contagious, unstoppable joy of a whole block of people dancing together on a hot summer night. It was music of the body, and it celebrated the body, and there was something healing and generous in that. In a world that could be hard on people, that ground them down all week at jobs that gave little back, the funk showed up on a summer evening and reminded everyone that they were alive, that they had bodies that could move and dance and feel joy, that pleasure and celebration were their birthright too. It asked nothing of you but that you show up and move, and in return it gave you a night of pure belonging, out in the open, among your own people, under the stars. Those block parties were the neighbourhood at its very best, and that is the thing most worth remembering about them. They were free and they were open, and they belonged to everyone, and they turned an ordinary city street on an ordinary summer night into a scene of communal joy that people would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The cord ran out the window, the bass rolled down the block, the horns lit up the dusk, and a whole community came together and danced. There are worse things for a people to build together than a night like that, and few things better. On one of those hot nights, In one particular corner of the Bronx, a young disc jockey does something small that will echo for 50 years. He notices that the crowd goes wildest during the break, that stretch of a record where the singing drops out and only the drums remain. So he buys 2 copies of the same record and learns to loop that break, spinning it back and forth, stretching the best few seconds into forever. Kids start dancing differently to it, low and acrobatic. Somebody grabs a microphone just to keep the party moving. Nobody in that room knows they're standing at a beginning. That is usually exactly how a beginning feels. The insight was so simple that its genius is easy to miss, and that is often the way with the ideas that change everything. He had watched the crowd night after night, and he had noticed something. There was one part of certain records where the whole room seemed to catch fire, that stripped-down stretch where the melody fell away and left nothing but the raw rhythm, the drums and the bass locked together, naked and pounding. The dancers lived for that part, and it was always too short, over in a handful of seconds, and the energy it built had nowhere to go before the song moved on. So he solved it in the most direct way imaginable. He bought 2 copies of the same record, and he set them both spinning on his 2 turntables, and he learned to play that magic break on the first record and then, right as it ended, to bring in the very same break on the second record. So it began again, without a pause. Then he spun the first record back to the start of the break, and when the second one ended, he brought the first one in again, back and forth, hand to hand, keeping that stretch of pure rhythm going and going for as long as he pleased. He'd taken the best few seconds of a song and made them last forever. The dancers understood immediately in their bodies, and they answered him. When the break kept going, they had room to do things they had never had room to do before, and a whole new way of moving was born right there on the floor. They dropped down low, they spun and froze and threw their bodies into acrobatic shapes, feeding off the endless rhythm, each dancer pushing the next to do something wilder. A circle would form, and one after another the best of them would leap into the centre and take their turn, and the crowd would roar. It was athletic, it was competitive, it was joyful, and it had never existed until that looping break gave it the space to be born. Then somebody picked up a microphone, and another piece fell into place. At first it was nothing grand, just a voice over the music keeping the party moving, calling out to the crowd, hyping the dancers, tossing out rhymes to ride along on top of the beat, talk on the rhythm, in time with the rhythm, playful and boastful and quick. It was a small thing, a party trick, a way of working the room. But it grew, that very night and the nights after, into something with a life of its own, a whole new voice that would eventually carry all the way around the world. And here is the thing that makes it all so precious looking back. Not a single person in that room knew what was happening. There was no sense of history being made, no feeling of a beginning. There was only a hot night, and a party, and a clever disc jockey keeping the crowd on its feet, and some kids dancing in a new and thrilling way, and a voice on the microphone urging everyone on. It was just a good party in a rough corner of the city that most of the world had written off entirely. That was all it was, and that was all it needed to be. But that is so often exactly how the biggest things begin, unannounced, unnoticed, in the humblest of places, among people nobody important is paying any attention to. The powerful do not tend to be present at the birth of the things that change the world. The change is born instead in a rec room, at a block party, in a poor neighbourhood on a hot night, out of nothing but ingenuity and joy, and the simple wish to keep a good party going a little longer. The people who make it are usually the last to know how much they have made. The sound that got born on those turntables in that corner of the Bronx would travel further than anyone standing there could possibly have dreamed. It would spread across the city, and then the country, and then the entire globe, and it would give a voice to millions upon millions of people who had never had one before. But on this particular hot night, it was still just a party, still just a beginning that felt like nothing more than a very good time. And that, in the end, may be the most beautiful part of the whole story. Let us leave the city entirely now and push open a barroom door somewhere south, where the jukebox glows and the beer is cold and the music has a real chip on its shoulder. Nashville had grown slick and orderly, so a handful of long-haired singers grew their beards, went their own way, and made country music sound dangerous again. In the honky-tonk on a Saturday night, the steel guitar cries and the whole room sings the sad parts loudest, the way you only can among strangers who understand exactly what you mean. It was rebellion in a cowboy hat, and somehow it felt like coming home. The honky-tonk was a world unto itself, and you knew it the moment you stepped inside. It was dim and close, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of spilled beer soaked into old wood, and the neon glow of the beer signs painted everything in soft reds and blues. There was sawdust on the floor, or peanut shells, and a long bar down one side, and a little stage or maybe just a corner where the band set up, and out in the middle a scuffed dance floor that had seen 10,000 slow songs. It was not much to look at. It did not need to be. It was a refuge, and everyone who came through the door was looking for the same thing. The music that filled it had grown angry, and that was the whole story of these years. Up in Nashville, the country music business had gotten smooth and polished. All strings and choirs and careful arrangements, sanded down until it offended nobody and stirred nobody either. And a handful of singers looked at all that polish and wanted no part of it. They grew their hair long and their beards wild, which was a genuine scandal in that world, and they walked away from the machine to make their music their own way, rough and honest and stripped back down to what mattered. And what they made sounded dangerous again, sounded true again, and people who had drifted away from country music came flooding back to it. These outlaws sang about the hard and the real, about drinking and heartbreak and prison and the long road, about people who had made a mess of their lives and knew it, and were not asking anyone's pardon. There was grit in it, and defiance, and a refusal to pretend that life was tidy. It did not talk down to anyone. It met people where they actually lived, in the middle of their troubles, and that honesty was worth more than all the polish in Nashville. The steel guitar was the sound of the whole thing, the sound of the ache at the centre of it. That crying, sliding, weeping wail seemed to say the things the words could not, and when it rose up over a slow song in a crowded honky-tonk, it went straight through you. It sounded like longing itself, like every regret and every lost love and every lonesome mile of highway, and the whole room felt it together. There is no instrument quite like it for the particular business of putting sorrow into sound, and in the honky-tonk on a Saturday night, it did that holy work over and over, and the room sang along, especially to the sad parts, and there was something almost sacred in that. A song would come to its heartbroken chorus and the whole barroom would lift its voice as one. All these strangers, all these hard-worked and hard-luck people singing the sorrow together at the top of their lungs. There is a strange deep comfort in that, in sharing your grief out loud with a room full of people who know exactly what you mean, who have felt exactly what you feel. You came in carrying your troubles alone, and for the length of a song you set them down among friends, and they were lighter for the sharing. That was the paradox at the heart of the honky-tonk, and the thing that made it more than just a bar. It was rebellious, defiant, an outlaw's music played in an outlaw's room, a thumb in the eye of everything slick and proper and polite. And yet, at the very same time, It felt like coming home. Because home, real home, is the place where you can be exactly who you are, troubles and all, and be understood without a word of explanation. The honky-tonk was that place for people who often could not find it anywhere else, and the outlaw music playing on its stage was the sound of a welcome. You would stumble out at closing time into the cool night air, ears ringing, heart somehow both heavier and lighter than when you came in. You had drunk and danced and sung your sorrows and laughed with strangers who felt like kin, and the hard week behind you and the hard week ahead of you both seemed for a moment a little more bearable. That was what the honky-tonk gave and what the outlaws sang for. It was rough, and it was real, and it was defiant, and it was tender, all at once. And for a great many people, it was the truest room in their whole hard-working lives. Now brace yourself, because the biggest sound of the decade is about to hit you square in the sternum. The arena show has arrived. 20,000 people in the dark and a wall of amplifiers taller than a house. The lights drop, the crowd becomes one enormous animal, and the first chord lands like weather, hard rock, and the new, heavier thing they are only starting to call metal turn the concert into a rite of passage, a place to be gloriously, deafeningly young for one whole night. You went home with your ears ringing and something inside you quietly rearranged. Some of us are still a little deaf from it, and honestly glad. The scale of it was the first shock, and nothing had prepared you for it. You had heard the music 100 times on your own little stereo, in your bedroom, tinny and small, and now here it was made enormous, played through a wall of speakers stacked to the rafters, loud enough to move the air in the room, loud enough to press against your body like a physical thing. The band, tiny down on their distant stage, commanded a sound so vast it seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the walls, from the floor, from inside your own chest. It was overwhelming in the truest sense of the word, and that was exactly the point. The waiting was its own long, delicious agony. You found your seat, or your patch of floor, and the arena slowly filled around you, 20,000 people packing in, the noise of the crowd building and building. And then, at last, the house lights went down and the whole enormous place erupted. A roar you felt in your teeth, and in the darkness you could see the little flames of lighters flickering to life all across the arena like a field of stars. The anticipation reached an almost unbearable pitch. The whole crowd holding its breath together, waiting for the first note to break the dam. And then it came, that first massive chord, and it hit you square in the chest like a wave, like weather, like something with real physical force. The lights blazed up, the band exploded into motion, and 20,000 people lost their minds at the same instant. There was no easing into it. It arrived all at once, at full volume, an assault of sound and light so total that for a moment you could not think at all, could only feel it slamming into you, and the feeling was pure electric joy. The joy of being young and loud and alive in a dark room full of people who wanted the exact same thing. The crowd became one creature, and that was the strange transcendent heart of it. 20,000 separate people, strangers all, melted together in the dark into a single enormous animal that moved and roared and swayed as one. You raised your fist because the whole crowd raised its fist. You shouted the words because the whole crowd shouted them. The boundaries between you and the stranger beside you simply dissolved in the noise and the dark, and for a few hours you were not an individual at all, but a single cell in something vast and pulsing and gloriously alive. There are not many experiences in a life that dissolve a person like that, and the ones there tend to be remembered forever. For the young, it was a rite of passage, and everyone understood it as such, even if nobody said so out loud. Your first big arena show was a threshold you crossed, a night you would measure other nights against for the rest of your life. It was loud, and it was overwhelming, and it was a little dangerous, or felt that way, and it belonged entirely to the young. The grown-up world was nowhere in that dark arena. For one whole night the place belonged to you, and 20,000 others exactly your age, and you claimed it completely, and you were never quite the same after. And you paid for it, in the sweetest possible way, with your hearing. You walked out afterward into the cool night, ears ringing, that high, thin whine that would stay with you for a day or two, and everything sounded muffled and far away, and you did not care one bit. That ringing was a badge, proof that you had been there, that you had stood inside a sound that enormous, and let it wash right through you. Some of us carry a little of that ringing still, all these years later, a permanent small souvenir of a loud and glorious youth, and if you asked us whether we would trade it back for perfect hearing, most of us would tell you no, because the arena on those nights gave the young something they could not get anywhere else, a place to be completely, deafeningly, unapologetically alive, to feel a sound in your body, to lose yourself in a crowd, to stand in the dark with 20,000 of your own kind and let something enormous move through all of you at once. It rearranged something inside a person, quietly, permanently, and sent them back out into their ordinary lives, carrying a memory of a night when the whole world was loud and bright and belonged, for a few hours, entirely to them. Let us slip into a downtown movie house on a Saturday afternoon, the kind with sticky floors and a marquee that has plainly seen better decades. On the screen, a lone hero moves through his enemies with impossible grace, and the whole audience leans and ducks and cheers as one body. The martial arts craze swept in from Hong Kong and landed hard, and for the price of a single ticket you could spend an afternoon believing that discipline and a pure heart could beat any odds at all. Kids poured out onto the sidewalk afterward, throwing slow, careful kicks at the empty air. It was a matinee and a whole philosophy at the very same time. The theatre itself was well past its glory days, and that was part of its shabby charm. The velvet seats were worn thin and the springs poked through, and the floor was sticky underfoot with decades of spilled soda, and the whole place smelled of old popcorn and older carpet. The marquee outside had letters missing. Once upon a time it had been a grand movie palace, and you could still see the ghost of that grandeur in the faded gilt trim and the sagging curtains. Now it showed these wild imported films to a rowdy Saturday crowd, and honestly it had never been more alive. The films came from across the world, from the film studios of Hong Kong, and they were like nothing the American movie houses usually showed. The dubbing was often a beat behind the lips, and the plots were sometimes hard to follow, and none of that mattered in the slightest, because what these films had was the fighting, and the fighting was extraordinary. The heroes moved with a grace and a speed and a power that seemed to defy the plain facts of the human body, leaping, spinning, striking, flowing from one impossible motion to the next. You had never seen anyone move like that. Nobody had. And the audience was half the show, maybe more than half. This was not a crowd that sat quietly in the dark. This was a crowd that lived and breathed every frame, that leaned when the hero leaned, that ducked the blows and threw the punches right along with him, that erupted into cheers when he finally turned the tables on his tormentors. When the hero took a beating, the whole room groaned as one. When he rose back up to fight, the whole room roared. It was less like watching a movie than like being at a game. Everyone caught up together in the same rising and falling tide of it. But underneath the spectacle, there was something more, and the kids in those seats felt it even if they could not have put it into words. These films carried a whole philosophy in them, a set of ideas about discipline and patience and honour, and the long hard road of becoming strong. The hero was almost never the biggest or the most powerful. He won because he had trained harder, suffered more, mastered himself more completely, and kept a purer heart than his enemies. He won because of who he was inside, and that was a genuinely radical and thrilling idea for a young person to absorb on a Saturday afternoon. For the price of a single ticket, that idea was yours to carry home. It said that you did not have to be born big or rich or powerful to prevail. It said that discipline could be a kind of magic, that patient practice could make you formidable, that the person willing to train in the dark while others slept could one day overcome those who seemed impossibly stronger. For every kid who felt small, who felt overlooked, who felt like the odds were stacked against them, that was an intoxicating promise, and they drank it down thirstily in the flickering dark. And so they poured out onto the sidewalk afterward transformed, and that was the sweetest sight of all. The film was over, but the spell had not broken, and the kids came out into the afternoon light already moving like the heroes they had just watched. They threw slow, careful kicks at the empty air. They struck poses. They fought elaborate battles against invisible enemies all the way down the block, and for a little while, in their own minds, they truly were those masters, graceful and disciplined and unbeatable. The magic followed them right out of the theatre and down the street, and, for some of them, into whole years of lessons at the studio across town. It was a small and joyful thing, a Saturday matinee at a rundown theatre, and yet it left its mark on a generation. It brought a whole distant culture rushing into towns that had never glimpsed it before. It planted ideas about discipline and self-mastery in a great many young hearts, and it gave countless kids one glorious afternoon of believing completely that with a pure heart and enough hard practice they could stand up to anything the world might throw at them. That is quite a lot to get for the price of a single ticket, and those who spent their Saturdays that way remember every sticky, flawed minute of it fondly. Now let us step somewhere much quieter, into an ordinary living room where something extraordinary is happening among the folding chairs. A dozen women have gathered, as women were gathering all over the country, to do a simple and revolutionary thing, to talk honestly about their own lives, and to discover just how much they had in common. There is coffee, there are cigarettes. There is a growing electric realization that the private ache each of them had been carrying was never really private at all. Consciousness raising, they called it, and out of those small circles came a movement that rearranged the whole American house. It began, as big things so often do, with people simply telling one another the truth. The room itself was nothing special, and that was rather the whole point. It was somebody's living room, borrowed for the evening, the good chairs and a few folding ones dragged in from the kitchen to make a rough circle. There were the ordinary furnishings of an ordinary home, the television in the corner switched off for once, the family photographs on the wall, the ashtray already filling up on the coffee table. Nothing about the place announced that anything important was about to happen there. It looked like a place where women had always gathered, and in a way it was. Only what they had gathered to do this time was entirely new. They came in from their separate lives, from houses and husbands and children and jobs, and they settled into the circle a little uncertainly at first. Because this was not a card party, and it was not a church group, and it was not any of the familiar reasons women had always had for coming together. This was something else. Something that did not quite have a name yet, and there was a nervousness in the room at the start of it, a sense of stepping out onto ice that might or might not hold. They poured the coffee and lit the cigarettes and looked around at one another and wondered quietly whether anyone else felt what they felt. And then someone began to talk, really talk, honestly, about her own actual life. And the ice held. She spoke about things that women simply did not say out loud in those days, the frustrations and the loneliness, the sense of a self quietly disappearing under the endless work of keeping a home and a family running. She spoke about wanting more, and about feeling guilty for wanting more, and about the strange hollow ache of a life that looked complete from the outside and did not feel complete from within. And as she spoke, the other women leaned in because they knew, every one of them knew exactly what she meant. That was the electric moment, the moment everything turned on, and it happened in living room after living room all across the country. The discovery that you were not alone, the stunning realization that the private ache you had carried in silence for years, believing it was your own personal failing, your own secret weakness, was in fact shared by nearly every woman in the room. What each of them had thought was her problem turned out to be their problem, a shared condition, something built into the very shape of their lives. And the instant a private trouble becomes a shared one, it stops being a source of shame and starts being something else entirely. It starts being something you can change. The circle grew braver as the evening went on, and the truth-telling gathered its own momentum. One woman's honesty gave the next woman permission, and the next, until the words were tumbling out, stories and frustrations and long-buried feelings finally finding the open air. There was laughter in it, and there were tears, and there was a rising warmth, and a fierce new energy in the room. These were women who had spent their lives tending to everyone else's needs and swallowing their own. And here, for one evening, in this ordinary living room, they turned their full attention to their own lives and spoke the truth of them out loud to people who understood. They called it consciousness raising, that plain and hopeful name, and what a thing it turned out to be. Because raising a consciousness is exactly what happened in those circles. Women walked in seeing their lives one way, as a set of private individual struggles, and walked out seeing them another way entirely, as part of something much larger and more shared. And once you see a thing that way, you cannot unsee it. The scattered private aches, added all together, revealed themselves as a pattern, and a pattern is something that can be named and questioned and eventually changed. Out of these small living room circles, a great movement gathered its strength. What moves me most about it is how humble the beginning was, how quiet and ordinary and human. There was no grand hall, no stage, no great leader at a podium. There were only a dozen women, some folding chairs, a pot of coffee, and the simple, radical, world-changing act of telling one another the truth. It reminds you that the biggest changes do not always announce themselves with trumpets. Sometimes they start in a living room, on a weeknight, among neighbours, with nothing more than honesty and the courage to say out loud the thing you'd always been told to keep quiet. That is where the American house began, gently, to rearrange itself, and it began with people simply being honest with one another, which is a thing worth remembering never stops being powerful. The 70s were restless in the spirit too, and a great many people went looking for their answers in brand new places. Some sat cross-legged and learned to meditate, repeating a single secret word until the noise of the day finally went soft. Others paid good money to sit in a hotel ballroom for an entire weekend while someone shouted them toward enlightenment. There were gurus and workshops and paperback books promising to unlock the self like a stubborn jar. It is easy to smile at now, but underneath it all was a very human hunger, the plain wish to feel whole in a world that would not stop speeding up. That particular wish never really went out of style. The meditation was perhaps the gentlest of all these searches and the most lasting. It arrived from the far side of the world, brought over by teachers who taught a simple practice, sitting quietly, closing the eyes, repeating a single word over and over until the endless chatter of the mind finally began to settle. People took to it in astonishing numbers, ordinary people, businessmen and housewives and college students, sitting cross-legged on their living room floors morning and evening, seeking a few minutes of stillness in the middle of their busy lives. There was nothing strange about wanting that. The world was loud and getting louder, And here was a way to find a little quiet inside yourself, a room in your own mind where the noise could not follow. Others went looking in far more dramatic places. There were the weekend seminars, the ones held in hotel ballrooms, where people paid good money to be locked in a room for 2 long days and pushed hard towards some breakthrough understanding of themselves. They were intense affairs, sometimes harsh, the leaders confronting people, challenging them, refusing to let them hide behind their usual defences. People wept in those rooms and shouted, and had what they described afterward as revelations, moments where something long stuck finally came loose. Whether it lasted is another question, but the hunger that drove people into those ballrooms was real enough. The desperate wish to break through to something truer. And the books, oh, the books. This was a golden age of the paperback that promised to change your life, and the drugstore racks groaned under the weight of them. They promised to unlock your hidden potential, to heal your wounded inner self, to teach you the secret of confidence or peace or love or success. People bought them by the millions and read them on buses and in waiting rooms and in bed at night, underlining the passages that seemed to speak directly to them, hoping that this one finally might hold the key. Each book was a small act of hope, a few dollars spent on the possibility that the self really could be figured out and fixed and made whole. There were the gurus too, teachers who gathered followers around them, some wise and some less so, some sincere and some frankly not. People travelled great distances to sit at their feet, to receive their teachings, to belong to a community organised around a search for something higher. And here is where a gentle word of caution belongs, because not every teacher who promised the way was worthy of the trust placed in them, and some of these searches led people into places that did them real harm. The hunger was innocent, but the hunger also made people vulnerable, and not everyone who fed on that hunger meant them well. But it would be a mistake, I think, to be too quick to laugh at all of it, because underneath every bit of it was something deeply and recognisably human. These were people who sensed that the ordinary answers were not quite enough. The paycheck, the house, the car, the television, all the things they had been promised would make them happy, had somehow not made them whole. And rather than simply accept that hollowness, they went looking. They tried things. They sat cross-legged and went to the ballrooms and read the books, and followed the teachers, all in pursuit of a fuller and more meaningful way of being alive. There is something brave in that refusal to settle, whatever you make of the particular paths they took. Because the world really was speeding up, and it has not slowed down since. And the hunger that drove all that searching has only grown more familiar with the years. The wish to quiet the noise, the wish to understand yourself, the wish to feel whole and centred and at peace in a life that pulls you in 1,000 directions at once. Those wishes did not belong only to the 70s. They belong to every one of us, and they are as alive today as they ever were, only now we chase them with different books and different teachers and different apps glowing on our phones. The seekers of that restless decade were not so different from us. They were simply among the first to go looking so openly and in such great numbers. And some of them found what they were looking for, or enough of it to matter. Some carried a quiet meditation practice with them for the rest of their lives, a small daily stillness that steadied them through every decade that followed. Some took one true insight from a book or a ballroom and let it gently reshape the way they lived. Not every search ended in disappointment. The important thing, the human thing, was that they searched at all, that they looked at their comfortable, speeded up, unsatisfying lives and dared to believe there might be more, and went looking for it with open and hopeful hearts. That wish for wholeness is one of the tenderest things about us, and it never really goes out of style, and so we come to the end of it. The mirror ball slowed to a stop, the last van pulled out of the lot, the final chord left ringing in the dark. We have wandered through a whole restless decade tonight, through dance floors and basements, through empty pools and drained quiet communes, through the roar of the arena and the hush of a living room where a dozen women told each other the truth. It was loud, and it was bright, and it was gloriously alive. But underneath all the noise, remember what it really was. It was people, ordinary people, looking for a place to belong and a sound to call their own. They dressed for the night with real care. They followed the music down every highway. They built their little rooms and welcomed each other in, and they looked after one another in 100 small unremarkable ways that never made the history books. They did not think of themselves as living through something legendary. They were just living the way people always have, trying to be free and trying to be known. Maybe that is the thing to carry forward, into your own life, into tomorrow. Not the platform boots or the safety pins, but the spirit underneath them. The willingness to slow down and treat an ordinary evening as something worth savouring. The courage to be exactly who you are. The simple grace of making a place where others feel they belong. So tonight, as you settle deeper and let the day drift away, hold on to that gentle warmth. You do not have to chase anything. You do not have to be anyone but yourself. There is a room out there with your name on it, and there always was. Rest now. You made it to the end of the day, and that, all on its own, is enough. Good night.